My name is Mark, and this is a story I will never forget. I always dreamed of traveling across the USA by hitchhiking, enjoying the freedom of the road, the wind in my hair, and new acquaintances. That summer, I decided to make my dream come true. With an old backpack on my shoulders and a map in my hands, I set off on my journey. The first days were magical. I met friendly drivers, each of whom shared their story. But everything changed when I reached a remote highway in Arizona. It was a hot, deserted road where cars rarely passed. I had to walk most of the day until I saw an old pickup truck approaching. The driver stopped and rolled down the window. He was an older man with rough features and piercing eyes. His hair was gray, and his face was covered in wrinkles. He smiled, but there was something unsettling in his eyes that made me feel a slight discomfort. "Going far?" he asked in a gruff voice. "Yes, to the next town," I replied. "Hop in, I'll give you a lift," he said, opening the door. I got into the pickup and we drove off. The road was long, and the conversation with the driver was awkward. He barely spoke, only throwing short remarks and focusing intently on the road. From time to time he glanced at me, and his looks were filled with an inexplicable anxiety. After a few hours, we stopped at an old gas station. "I need to fill up," he said, turning off the engine. "Wait here." I stayed in the pickup, looking around. The gas station looked abandoned, and I didn't see a single soul. The driver walked toward a small store next to the gas station. I decided to take the opportunity and got out of the car to stretch my legs. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind me. Turning around, I saw a figure disappearing behind the corner of the building. My heart started pounding faster, and I decided it was time to move on. The driver returned with a bottle of water and a bag of chips. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "Everything's fine," he replied dryly. "Get in. We'll continue." We hit the road again, but now I felt even more uneasy. After a few hours, it began to get dark, and we drove onto a remote mountain road. The driver said it was a shortcut to the town. The road became narrower and more neglected. It seemed like we were driving deeper into a dead end. "Where are we?" I asked, trying not to show my anxiety. "Almost there," he replied, but his voice sounded eerie. Suddenly, the pickup stopped. The driver turned off the engine and turned to me. "Get out," he said. I couldn't believe my ears. What was he planning? I had no choice but to comply. We got out of the car, and he led me to an old house that looked abandoned. "Go inside," he ordered. My heart was racing. I couldn't understand what was happening. An inner voice told me to run, but where? We were in the middle of the desert, and the chances of finding help were minimal. Inside the house, it was dark and damp. The driver lit an old lamp, which illuminated only a small part of the room. I saw old furniture covered in dust and smelled mold. "Sit down," he said, pointing to a chair. I sat down, trying to understand what was going on. The driver pulled a knife out of his pocket and began to speak. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked. "No," I replied, feeling cold to my bones. "I've been looking for someone to help me. I need an assistant for my work," he said, approaching me with the knife in hand. "What work?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from trembling. "My family. They need sacrifices. You will be the next one," he said, his eyes gleaming with madness. I realized this was my chance to escape. I bolted toward the door, but the driver was faster. He grabbed my arm and threw me to the floor. I felt the cold blade of the knife touch my skin. Desperation gripped me. "No!" I screamed, trying to break free. At that moment, I heard a loud crash. The door of the house flew open, and a group of people burst in. They grabbed the driver and pulled him away from me. "You're safe," one of them said. "We're the police. We've been searching for this maniac for years." They handcuffed the driver and took him away. I was taken to a local hospital, where I finally felt safe. I learned that this man was a notorious serial killer who preyed on hitchhikers. He lured them to his house, where they disappeared without a trace. I survived, but this journey changed me forever. I will never hitchhike again. Every time I hear about maniacs or mysterious disappearances, I remember that night in the desert. The story became a lesson for me. Never trust strangers on the road, no matter how desperate the situation is. My name is Michael, and this story happened to me a few years ago when I decided to fulfill my long-standing dream of hitchhiking across the United States. I was a student seeking adventure and new experiences and thought that hitchhiking was the best way to get to know the country and meet interesting people. However, one night changed my perception of travel safety forever. It was summer when I was traveling from New York to Los Angeles. My journey was exciting. I met many friendly people, saw incredible landscapes, and felt true freedom. But one day, when I was already in Texas, nightfall caught me by surprise. Darkness came quickly, and I decided it would be better to find someone who could give me a ride to the nearest town rather than spend the night in the open. I was standing on the roadside with my thumb up when an old car drove past me. It suddenly stopped a few meters ahead, and I ran towards it. The driver was an elderly man with a wrinkled face and a gray beard. He smiled when I approached and said he could take me to the nearest town where there was a motel. "Get in, kid," he said. "It's dangerous to be on the road alone at night." I thanked him and got into the car. Inside, it smelled of old wood and cigars. We started driving, and I noticed that the man was very taciturn. He answered my questions briefly and vaguely, but I chalked it up to his age. Time passed, and we kept driving further and further down the dark road. I tried to make conversation, but he only hummed in response. I began to worry, thinking that we should have already reached the town, but there was only darkness around us. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore and asked how much longer it would be. "Don't worry, we'll be there soon," he replied, but there was a strange note in his voice. Suddenly, we turned onto an even darker road that seemed to lead nowhere. The trees grew thicker and the fog denser. My heart started beating faster as I realized we had veered off the main road. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my panic in check. "There's a place we can stay for the night," he said with a smile that scared me more than it reassured me. We drove for a few more minutes, and suddenly an old motel illuminated by dim lights appeared before us. It looked abandoned, but the man assured me it was a safe place. "You can rest here," he said, and with no other choice, I followed him. Inside, the motel was even worse. Old furniture, creaky floors, and the smell of mold. We approached the front desk, and the man standing there handed us keys to our rooms. He didn't say a word, just stared at me with his cold eyes. When I entered my room, I immediately felt even worse. The bed was broken, the windows boarded up, and the walls peeling. But the worst part was that I heard whispering. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the whispering grew louder. I decided not to sleep and stayed sitting on the bed, trying to understand what was happening. Suddenly, my door opened, and I saw the same elderly man. He was holding an old lantern and smiling. "It's time to go," he said. "Where?" I asked, but he just smiled wider. "He's waiting for you." I didn't know what to do. It felt like a terrible dream, but everything was too real. I got up and followed him, hoping to find a way out of this place. We walked down a long corridor that seemed endless. The whispering grew louder, and I started to make out the words, "Follow us. Join us." Suddenly, we stopped in front of a large door. The man opened it, and inside I saw a dark room filled with the dim light of candles. In the center stood a table, surrounded by people in black cloaks. They all turned to me, and I saw that they had no faces. "Welcome," one of them said, and I felt the blood freeze in my veins. I tried to escape, but they grabbed me and tied me to a chair. One of them came closer and leaned into my ear. "Now you're one of us," he whispered. I screamed, but no one heard me. They started chanting some incantations, and I felt cold envelop my body. It was as if I was torn from reality and found myself in darkness, surrounded by whispering. When I came to, it was already morning. I was lying on the roadside, where passers-by found me. They said I looked like a madman, covered in dirt and scared. I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. The motel I described didn't exist, and no one had seen the old car. This journey changed me forever. I never hitchhiked again, and never forgot that night when I faced an inexplicable horror. Since then, I realized that not all roads lead to a safe place, and not everyone who offers help has good intentions. My name is Liam, and what I am about to tell happened to me one time when I decided to travel by hitchhiking. I've always been an adventurer, and the thought of traveling without a plan always seemed exciting to me. But that evening changed my life forever. It happened in the summer when I decided to go from New York to Los Angeles. My route passed through picturesque roads and small towns. One evening, as the sun was already setting, I stood on the side of the road, hoping to catch the next driver. Finally, a white pickup truck stopped in front of me. "Where are you heading?" asked the driver, a tall, middle-aged man with short gray hair and a wrinkled face. "To Los Angeles," I replied. "All right, I'm heading that way. Hop in." I packed my backpack and got into the car. Inside, it smelled of old cigarettes, and the seats had stains that reminded me of many passengers before me. The driver introduced himself as Henry. We talked about life, travel, and other small things. He seemed quite friendly, although something in his gaze bothered me. As night fell, Henry suggested stopping for the night at a small motel he knew. I agreed, thinking it would be a good idea to rest before the long journey. When we reached the motel, the place looked abandoned and a bit creepy, but fatigue took over. We rented 2 rooms and agreed to meet in the morning. The night was quiet, but my heart beat faster than usual. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Waking up in the middle of the night, I heard strange sounds coming from the hallway. It sounded like someone was whispering and creaking the wooden floor. I quietly got out of bed and peeked into the hallway. A shadow flickered near Henry's door. I approached closer and my heart beat even harder. The shadow did not look like a person, but something supernatural. I returned to my room and locked the door, hoping it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. In the morning, Henry looked normal, but I felt that something had changed between us. We continued our journey, but the feeling of anxiety did not leave me. With each mile, I felt more and more uneasy. Henry no longer talked as much as before, and his looks became colder. Somewhere in the desert, the car suddenly stopped. Henry said it was some mechanical problem and went out to check the engine. I also got out of the car, feeling that something was wrong. And suddenly I saw an old, rusty knife lying right under my feet on the road. "What is this?" I asked, picking up the knife. Henry turned to me and his face twisted into a horrible smile. "This is your fate, boy," he said coldly. I ran, but the desert seemed endless. Henry chased after me, and I felt his breath getting closer. My head spun from fear, but I kept running, not stopping. Finally, I saw an old hut and rushed there, hoping to find shelter. The interior of the hut was dark and damp. I hid in a corner, holding my breath. Outside the door, I heard Henry's heavy breathing. He entered and started searching for me. My heart beat so hard I feared he would hear it. "I know you're here," said Henry, his voice echoing throughout the hut. "You can't escape your fate." I closed my eyes and tried not to breathe. Henry approached, and I felt his shadow coming closer to me. But suddenly I heard another sound, the sound of a car approaching. Henry froze, then quickly left the hut. I seized the chance and ran outside. On the road stood another car, and I rushed to it. The driver, a young woman, saw me and opened the door. "What happened?" she asked. "Please help!" I screamed, getting into the car. "It's dangerous here!" We quickly drove off, leaving Henry behind. I felt my soul come back to life. The young woman, who introduced herself as Sarah, listened to my story and assured me we would go to the nearest police station. When we arrived at the police station, I told my story to the officers. They immediately set out to search for Henry. I stayed with Sarah, feeling grateful for her help. She said she was also traveling by hitchhiking and knew how dangerous it could be. My journey ended, and I returned home, leaving my adventures behind. But that night, I realized that the world is much more dangerous than I thought. Hitchhiking, which seemed romantic and exciting to me, turned into a horrible nightmare. Now I know I must be careful and trust my intuition. This story will forever remain in my memory as a warning that even the simplest journey can turn into deadly danger. I will never return to hitchhiking again, but the lesson I learned will stay with me forever.